Hello, everybody, and welcome to this IOSH webinar. I am Ruth Wilkinson, and I am the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. I will introduce my panel in a moment, but I'll just do a quick introduction of what session brings us here today. And the title of the session is What's Next After 50 Years of Progress? And this is all about the Health and Safety at Work Act in Great Britain, which has reached its 50th anniversary. So half a century has passed since the implementation of the Act in Great Britain. And I wanted to bring together key colleagues on a panel today to explore the impact that the Act has had across that time period and examine, if anything, needs to change to ensure that it is still fit for purpose. I mean, when the Act gained royal assent, it was back on the 31st of July in 1974, and then it came into force in October in 1974, which is why we're here today in October 2024, some 50 years on. When the Act came into place, it provided a framework for managing health and safety in Great Britain to protect people at work as well as others who could be impacted by that work. And it marked a move away from the previous prescriptive legislation, and it set out clear requirements for employers and for others who had duties stipulated in that Act. So some 5 decades on, we've followed and we have seen in Great Britain the number of fatalities at work have drastically reduced. And we've also sort of seen and we've heard how the legislation itself has influenced the creation of similar legislation in other countries, one of which is Singapore. And we've got a colleague with us on the call today on the panel, and we'll explore that further in a moment. But what we want to do on the panel is it's important to look back, but it's also really important to look forward and make sure that, we are still fit for purpose and make sure that the legislation can still be effective with the current world of work and occupational safety and health hazards and risks going forward. So without further ado, then I'd like to introduce colleagues on the panel. I'll first introduce Paul Verico, who's joining us from Eversheds, Sutherland. You might have seen Paul recently in an IOSH magazine article that was talked about the 50th year of the Health and Safety at Work Act. And Paul joins us. He's a solicitor advocate, chartered member of IOSH, a qualified teacher and a fellow of IIRSM. So thank you for joining us, Paul. We talked about in the opener that we will have a look how the legislation has influenced in other countries, and we'll use Singapore as a case study and a reference point on the session today. So I'd like to introduce Nurul Ashikin, and Nurul is the chair of our IOSH Singapore branch. Thank you, Nurul. And I do want to say that I'm really grateful for you joining us and giving the Singapore perspective. But for everybody listening, this will be Nurul's own opinion on how that has been introduced in Singapore. And I'm really grateful for you joining to do that for us today, Nurul. And last but not least, I've got Kevin Myers, who I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. Kevin, he brings 40 years of experience from the Great British Health and Safety Executive. Kevin has held various roles at the HSE through that time. He was also HSE's Deputy Chief Executive, running from 2008 until 2016, and also President of the International Association of Labour Inspection, termed IALI. For a period of time, I was also IALI's Secretary General and a Vice President. So I'm sure you'll all agree we've got a great panel here, and you'll welcome all Paul, Nurul and Kevin to the session. And you'll all bring different perspectives to the anniversary, to the conversation on the anniversary of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So without further ado then, I'd like to get into a question that I will pitch to all of you. And I will come to you first, Kevin, if that's okay. So the first question will be, how impactful do you believe the Act has been, so across the 50 years? How big a role has it played in the reduction of reported workplace fatalities? So I'll hand the floor to you, please, Kevin.
it's had a significant impact. It was transformational in terms of its approach and its philosophy. Um, but I think it's important not just to talk about the Act, but about the philosophy that the Act tries to bring in. But in terms of the statistics, there have been significant reductions over the 50 years. Quite a few of those reductions would have occurred anyway, I suspect, without the Health and Safety at Work Act, just because of the changing profile of risk within our society. But having said that, work HSE did many years ago looked at that impact, and they were saying that you can actually statistically demonstrate the effect of the change of the profile of risk, but there are still significant improvements above and beyond that. We did a piece of work a couple of years ago. We being me as a hobby and three colleagues, four colleagues, to look at the 50th anniversary of Robins, and that work demonstrated that you can see that there'd been, an 88% reduction in the number of fatalities since the Act came in. As I said, some of that will be changing in the economy, but also we need to bear in mind that the Act brought in 8 million new workers to within scope. So I think it's been significant. But as I said, it's also the OSH system within society that it's created. So to simplify it back in 1972, when the Robins report was being written, it was largely a sort of transactional relationship between the regulator and businesses, and that was seen as the main thing. And the regulator wrote rules, prescriptive rules, as to how risk should be managed, and people followed them to a better or less extent. But Robin said that is so outdated. The people that create the risks should be responsible for managing them, not being told how to do so by government. Government can't keep up with innovation and changes, and you need to have an approach which says the primary responsibility, you need an outcome-based philosophy instead of written rules. The person that creates the risk should be responsible for management and control. They should do that in consultation with those people exposed to the risk. Greater emphasis on self-regulation. And that's not the euphemism for no regulation. That is actually employers, their representatives stepping up to the plate. And they created a new body called HSE to try and act as the prime mover to make that system work. But the system is, you can demonstrate that by the number of IOSH members there were. When I joined HSE in 1976, there were few OSH professionals in industry, but there are now hundreds of thousands of them that are helping their companies, their organizations manage and control risks. So it's made a significant impact, not just through the legislation, but the system that the Robins analysis proposed.
You've given us some very key points there, Kevin, and you're right, talking about that entire system for which it has helped formulate, it operates within. It's also reminded us that the Health and Safety Executive are also reaching that 50th year, that landmark as well. Paul, I'll come to you next, please, with that same question around how impactful it's been and the role that it has played with regards to fatalities and
Yeah.
bring anything else and you'd like to bring in, just like Kevin did, the system. I think it's all important just to look back before we look forward.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm primarily a corporate safety defence lawyer, and I defend mostly very large organisations when things go wrong. And what I would say is my experience kind of operating around the globe is that American clients are absolutely flummoxed that we have a criminal system dealing with safety, because to them, the idea that you can get a criminal conviction for an offence as a corporate body is an anathema to them and something that really perturbs them. Whereas I think those organisations that are UK headquartered or form mainly in the UK are kind of used to it. But we shouldn't mistake the fact that having a criminal framework for this elevates it on the risk register of most large corporations. And what I notice more than anything is that boards of directors of kind of the FTSE 100 and other very large organisations, blue chips, are concerned about the reputational damage that a criminal conviction brings more than they are about a fine in many ways, because they want to be seen, as Kevin said, to kind of embrace the spirit of modern responsibility as a leading organisation. And so that's really weighs quite heavily. And I think the fact that the legislation creates the framework for all of the subsidiary legislation that kind of explains how to demonstrate you've done all that's reasonably practicable, it obviously paves the way for all of that. What I would say is that I think that there's a very small proportion of very small companies that it makes no difference at all to, because I think that there are some organisations that will take a chance and are not au fait with the act, and they will just assume that things will be okay. And those are the ones statistically where there are far worse events. I think for large organisations, it provides something that they can then develop a safety management system around, and they can always look to themselves. If we came to a court of law, can we demonstrate that we did all that we reasonably could? And as everyone on this panel knows, looking through the lens of hindsight and retrospect is a really difficult thing.
I like to echo what Kevin and Paul has shared, because I think it's a great thing that 50 years ago the act came about, and I agree with what Kevin has said, that it has been transformative, right? And with a significant reduction, with a strong indication, the higher rate of adoption with regards to a lot of company and association who are employing competent health and safety professionals, and also the shift from the perspective from it being prescriptive to becoming a goal-setting legislation, that helps a lot of companies and organizations in terms of flexibility as well as a risk-based approach. I think Kevin also brought up about the establishment of the Health and Safety Executive, which I think was pivotal in enforcing the act as well as promoting the best practices around the area, the country, and when it comes to management, how risk should be managed, like what Kevin was also saying, that where the secondary legislation came about in the UK, where it talks about the management of health and safety at work regulation, I think that helped a lot of organizations, and from us in Singapore as well, right, to formalize risk management, what are the factors to look at. Also, when Paul mentioned the moral obligation, economical factors, and the legal implication, that was something that is a good practice, right? Because if we don't have any laws, any guidance to guide an organization or a country, it's very hard to manage and keep ourselves in check as well.
Thanks, Ural. Oh, Kevin, yeah, please do come back in. I was going to say, if anybody wants to talk about anything that I just heard.
It's the first time I'd heard that the American philosophy is in sort of organizational terms very, very different. And that I have to say that if you compare the health and safety performance of our country versus America, you'll find that we've got a much better performance in that sense. So but I hadn't realised that the OSHA legislation was considered not to be criminal legislation, as it were.
Yeah, the view very much is that it's a penalty rather than something where you can go to trial on. And that's why when you see most of the litigation in America, it is in a civil sector, and there is a negotiated settlement on damages, even in something as massive as Deepwater Horizon. And the OSHA penalties are typically administrative. So that's why I think for global organisations looking at England and the UK, it's right that they try and mirror that regime across. And of course, probably as alongside Singapore, Australia is the other area where they've really taken a look at the way that the best bits of the act and then enacted it and then actually broadened it. And I know this webinar is not particularly going to go into the area of well-being and mental health, but we do know that in Australia, they've developed the act to include psychosocial risk as something that comes within scope of the WHS Act in Australia. So that there's a future trend there, which we may come to later.
Yeah, I think that's it. You've given me some lovely little segues there, everybody. So we'll hold on to that I was just say how they've applied the Act in Australia and the introduction of the psychosocial risks. I do want to explore, where the world of work is now, and that I'm using the term about is the Act still fit for purpose, just to give us something to debate and talk about. Because let's face it, we're 50 years on. It's done a great job, and as you said, Neural, that goal setting legislation has been risk based, it's proportionate, and Kevin bringing in all of the good stuff from Robins that you've highlighted as well. So we're at this point, and I think, and Paul, as you started talking about in America and Australia, I think Neural, this is that opportunity to come to you, please. We're aware that the Act has influenced legislation in other countries, and we know Singapore is one of those. So we'd really like to just do a bit of a dive in with yourself from your perspective, and just talk to us of how that works in Singapore. How is it applied? What's the framework? Just so we can get a feel for how it has supported or contributed to other countries.
Um, I am a NIBOSH trainer as well as an IOSH trainer myself. So as part of our training, we do focus a lot on ILO conventions, protocols, recommendations, and then linking it back to Health and Safety at Work Act. And it has, in a way, because Singapore has also ratified with ILO Convention C155, we follow very much closely to the framework in the UK. And yes, it is a model for us, and we draw inspiration from the structure as well. In Singapore, we developed our Workplace Safety and Health Act 2006. And Singapore being a young country, we've just recently launched our Occupational Safety and Health 50th commemorative that was dating back to 1965, how we've come about with regards to health and safety in Singapore. Similar to Health and Safety at Work Act, the Singapore Workplace Safety and Health Act, same thing. We promote proactive risk management, where we encourage companies to identify hazards, managing them before they can cause any harm. We also encourage shared responsibilities, both the employers as well as employees having individual obligations morally, economically, and legally from that perspective, where we also employ, like what Paul has highlighted, the criminal section as well as civil section. So we have both acts in Singapore as well. And of course, the most important thing is the goal-setting legislation. So no longer we being very prescriptive in how we are managing safety. Rather, it's moving away from the rigid regulations and adapting to the very robust changing work environment. And fortunately for us, we have seen positive outcomes that has included a massive reduction in workplace injuries and fatalities. And our last year, based on 2023 statistics, our numbers was at 0.99 per 100,000 workers. So that was an objective or vision that in Workplace Safety and Health 2028 that we want to go below 1.0. So that is something that we have pride ourselves that we are moving towards our final objective. And back in 2006, when the Workplace Safety and Health Act was first launched, our former Minister for Manpower, Dr. Ng, he was saying that with this Workplace Safety and Health Act, we are able to learn from past mistakes, and it's an improvement for the legal framework for all of us to continue our daily operations. So that was very insightful from 2006 way back until where we are right now. So it's always an improvement to always make the country a safer place to work.
Can I just say something about Singapore? Because I know something
please.
about it, obviously not as much, but just to share an amusing story, I guess. The health and safety system has had a bumpy ride over the 50 years, just to talk euphemistically a little bit. And I had this really surreal experience where I can't remember exactly when it was, 2012, something like that. We were dealing with a government that was where the Prime Minister was talking about slaying the health and safety monster, if you remember that. And I'd been invited to go to the Singapore's International Advisory Panel to advise them on the development of their system. And I attended the conference, and the Deputy Prime Minister of the country stood up and said, our objective is to make Singapore's health and safety record the best in the world. And I felt as if I hadn't gone on a 13 hours flight from one country to
For
another,
nothing,
but
yeah.
I'd gone to another planet. But there you go.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, we follow very closely to what the UK laws have implemented, the regulations, international best practices, and because we ratify with C155, that gives us a basis and a foundation to follow that framework as well.
Brilliant. I think it's great to hear that it has had that influence beyond the boundaries of Great Britain. And Kevin, please do keep those insights coming. I think it just all adds to the colour and the picture that we're trying to build up here of the journey that we have been on. Oh, sorry, Neural, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, sorry, I just remember, and also because Singapore used to be a British colony, right? So naturally, the law just kind of trickled back as well. That's my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that's the beauty of that framework, how it can slot in. And thank you also for mentioning the International Labour Organization conventions as well, because it is really important that we, in advocating for good health and safety across in different countries, it's important we have that framework in place. And I think there are some real key aspects of how we do it in Great Britain that obviously have moved across country boundaries and have been implemented. So on that point, then I'm going to move to the next round of questions. And Paul, I will come to you first on this one, but I'll also just do a reminder and sort of a shout out to everybody who's listening. Please do put your questions in here. What we've done so far is just we've looked back because we need to look back to acknowledge all of the good things that the Act has brought, and we've got the insights from panelists now. But I do want to throw in the question and say, obviously, we talked about it being 1974 when the Health and Safety at Work Act came into force. We're obviously now in 2024, and the world of work is very different. You know, the services, the way in which we deliver work, so I guess I just want to throw that question out that I've been saying it, is it fit for purpose? So my question to all of you, and I say I'll come to Paul first, is do you think that the Act is still fit for purpose? And Neural, you mentioned about like the secondary legislation. Let's also consider that, is that secondary legislation that's there supporting the Act, is that still relevant? Or do we need a bit of an overhaul, or do we need something in between? So nothing's off the table. Paul, over to you first with the loaded question here.
I'm going to say that's a big question, isn't it? I'm going to say that I think the legislation is fit for purpose, but it needs a regulator that's fit for purpose alongside it. And I don't say that in any way deprecatingly of the Health and Safety Executive. When I started in practice 20 years ago, there were nearly 1,000 prosecutions a year, and those are well publicised, and that made a material difference to people's perceptions of the importance of health and safety. We look at the statistics for last year, and we have less than a third of those offences prosecuted. And over that time, successive governments have raided the executive of resource and manpower. And as a result of that, we find an executive that's creaking to be able to investigate anywhere near the number of incidents which would normally form part of the operating circular, which sets out what needs to be investigated. So from my perspective as a defence lawyer, it might sound almost counterintuitive. I actually think the executive needs to be far greater resourced so that it can effectively govern, investigate and enforce as appropriate in those circumstances. So I don't think it's a lack of the framework. I think it depends on the political will of whoever's governing the country to suggest that it's important and it needs to be properly prioritised. I'll throw that one out because I know Kevin might have a similar view or a contrary view with his HSE head on.
I thought very good answer there, Paul. And you're right. I think, Kevin, this is probably an opportune time for yourself to come in here.
Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of HSE, and actually I can not speak on behalf of HSE. I agree with Paul on the basic premise that HSE, the resources that HSE have got, does not I don't think, from where I sit, enable them to meet the aspirations that we have an expectation of. I think its role has moved from 1974, where it was the prime mover, but as the system has developed, it acts more like a catalyst than the prime mover, and that's Robins, I think, would say, yes, they're not the words I used, but yes, that's what I was talking about. But I think even if you're acting as a catalyst, you need to have a quantity of catalyst in order to catalyze the system. However, I would say that, Paul, that actually, if we're saying standards have improved over the years, you might expect less prosecutions 20 years on because the standards generally are better. I don't know whether HSE meets its performance standards in terms of its selection criteria for investigations and that. In terms of the specific question, Ruth, I think it is fit for purpose. I think the way in which the Act was framed, it future-proofed to a great extent. Who'd want to unpick the principles of outcome-based legislation where the primary responsibility lays? I think there's two areas where, if I was involved in it, I would be looking at now. One is the Act was written, the Robins report was in the 1970s. The Act is constructed primarily about an employer-employee relationship with some provision for the self-employed. I just wonder now whether the more flexible working arrangements that have developed for sometimes good, sometimes less good reasons, I wonder whether it's worth looking at whether you ought to be talking about workers rather than employees. Because the Act provides for self-employed situations, I think it's been okay until now, but I think that's worth a look at. And Paul I think it was referred to the Australians having changed their legislation, and I know a little bit about that as well. And when they reviewed it, they changed it from employee to worker, and that. The other area that if I was around, doing this, I'd be looking at is there's a very important provision in the Health and Safety at Work Act about provision of machinery and plant and equipment, and making the people that provide it have responsibility for ensuring it's safe, and that's worked really, really well. I just wonder whether it's structured around a certain language about provision of articles and things like that. I'd be looking at that to see whether it sufficiently covers AI going forward, and whether that might need a bit of a tweak, because I'm not sure whether you could define AI as an article, but I think that's the next risk threshold that's going to significantly be a game changer, as I understand it, and I'd be looking at that. So I think the Act is fit for purpose, but there are a couple of areas where I think it might need a bit of updating without attacking the basic principles that it sets out.
I think what's interesting about that is that Section 3 of the Act is obviously the bit that deals with non-employees, but it requires an employer to be the duty holder. I did quite a lot of work in Hong Kong, and interestingly, the Hong Kong legislation hasn't quite transposed the Section 3 obligation. It transposes Section 2 into Ordinance 6 of the Hong Kong Ordinance, but it doesn't transpose Section 3. And I think sometimes we forget how fortunate we are that there was the foresight to think about people who aren't just employees, but contractors and also members of the public.
Yes.
And so to that extent, as Kevin quite rightly says, I think it was kind of almost bomb-proofed by being in such general terms that enabled the legislation to the secondary legislation to build in around it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul and Kevin. I think I've jotted some of those key points down because I would like to explore them a little bit further, but I'll give Neural the opportunity to come in and answer that same question, please. And then I will sort of throw around some of what you've just said, just so we can debate a little bit further, because I'm interested in these points. Neural, please.
Yeah. So like what Kevin has also mentioned, is it still fit for purpose in 2024, right? So since since 1974 to 2024, 50 years later, there has been a lot of change. And, Kevin rightly mentioned, with the rise of automation, technology, and AI, yes, the secondary regulation, when we talk about management of health and safety at work risks, that has to be factored in, because all of these are evolving, right? There's always that workplace dynamics. There's a different type of people now working, the different type of competencies required. And also, you've also mentioned the difference between, breaking away from employees to generalizing everybody as a worker, right? Because we talk about worker, not just your own worker, but we're talking about gig workers as well. How do we do, and what kind of protection do we afford them when it comes to making sure that the freelancers, the contractors are also receiving the same type of moral support obligations that they should also be receiving. And of course, in this time and age, with all that has happened over the past few months, over the past few years, mental health is always on the radar. So we always talk about mental health, and how do we then enforce or understand or identify mental health stresses, mental health issues in our management of health and safety at work act, right? So that is something that we are always requiring a tweak, keeping up with the evolution, keeping up with the people, and with the competency gaps.
Lovely, thank you, Neural. And Jim, you mentioned the word mental health there, which was something I was just going to bring in, because I wanted to come back to Paul when you mentioned it earlier, that in Australia that they had brought in the psychosocial risk aspects. And I guess this is where it'd just be good to have this conversation amongst ourselves, because I've spoken to various people, as you will have done, sort of in the health and safety circles, and there is sort of mention of the health aspect, particularly the occupational health could be strengthened, and then do you get into the psychosocial risk aspect? So I've added a little question in here of my own, so I'm just going to throw it out there. It's been mentioned, and I don't know if you want to come in first, Paul, but just sort of thinking around that topic, given that we've had this framework, but then it's been moved on in different ways in other countries. And we know we're talking about psychosocial risks. We've got ISO standards, there's other frameworks in place. What do you reckon in the context of the Act?
It's the one thing that we spend most time talking about, and I am quite opinionated on it. So ISO 45003 is an absolutely excellent code. I think that it's very poorly implemented currently. 45001 remains the benchmark that people look to. And I think the psychosocial code, which actually pretty much mirrors the WHS code in Australia, it's modelled on 45003, but just brought it into the framework, is entirely appropriate. I think personally, as someone who spent 2 years doing my diploma, I am really concerned when safety professionals are given psychosocial risk, and it is assumed that because they are a safety professional, they are competent to risk assess, or they are competent to provide strategic advice to an organisation without further training. And we know full well that Regulation 13 of the management regs talks about the need for an employer to make sure that people are properly trained. And so I'm concerned that if it's just bolted on as an expectation, because the Act itself, you could say, subject to kind of a couple of the authorities on employment law, the Act does cover, or it's within the ambit of the Act to consider psychosocial risk. I am concerned that there is a skills gap, and that we are unwittingly asking too much of people to assume that they can automatically contend with what is a very difficult area, which does require specialist training. We've had clients who've been asking safety practitioners to do suicide risk assessments and things of that ilk, and they're not competent to do that, and that's really worrying, because you can make your best efforts, but then if something goes horribly awry, what that does to you as a human being is awful. So I'm concerned about that. In terms of actually raising it through the existing legislation, clearly the big shift would be to include some element of psychosocial harm in RIDDOR, because at the moment RIDDOR is silent on absences through mental health or the like. I come back to my earlier point. If you were going to enhance RIDDOR to encompass that, you would be potentially trebling the amount of riddors, and you would need a much larger workforce to be able to contend with that. At the moment, other sheds are working with a campaigner, Jodie Hill, who is actually looking at rewriting the secondary legislation in this area. And we've effectively said the legislation's not wrong, maybe something that's specifically focused on some of these obligations. But to my mind, it's about making sure that we've got a competent workforce who can actually do this professionally rather than expecting people just to be able to assume the role.
Some really good points on competency there, and that capacity building at that right level. And I'm sort of reflecting on the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization's guidelines on mental health at work and their policy brief, which does talk about having that competency and that mental health literacy, I think they term it, and having it at the right levels. As you say, there's an IOSH professional role, there's management roles, there's awareness level for employees. So and this is I'm taking loads of notes. I'm sure everybody listening in as well, because I'm sort of thinking back from our role in the influence and that advocacy agenda at IOSH as well. Before I move, I want to talk about some of the other points that we mentioned, but is there any other further thoughts on the psychosocial risk aspect? Because I'm going to get onto the employee and sort of self-employed in a moment. Kevin?
First of all, I need to declare an interest. I am chair of trustees of a charity called Mates in Mind, which is looking at trying to tackle mental health issues initially in the construction industry. Although what I say now is me speaking as an individual rather than wearing that hat, but just to avoid that ambiguity. Just a couple of points. First of all, we talked earlier on about the progress that's been made in fatal injuries and all of that since the Act was introduced. This is the one area where it's getting worse, not better. But also we need to recognise it's actually getting worse within society in terms of increased awareness, but also increased incidences of it and that. Mental health is clearly within the framework of the Health and Safety at Work Act. It isn't explicitly mentioned within the legislation. So the question I would ask myself is, if this is a clear and present and growing problem, what is our strategic approach to actually dealing with it? Do we need to make it more explicit? Do we need regulations? Do we need guidance? In response to some of what Paul said, I would just refer you back to the management standards that HSE developed years and years and years ago, which are a very accessible framework for seeking to address these issues in the work context. The problem from my perspective, and I've not had any conversation with HSE about it in terms of RIDDOR notification, the problem with mental health issues is when they manifest themselves, they are inevitably or normally a consequence of what's happening in our life, both in work and outside work. And it would be, I would think, you can get egregious cases where it's obvious and that, but more generally, everything could be happy at work, everything could be good at work, you can cope with the pressures of it, and then something terrible happens to you in your private life, and then you can't cope with the stuff you were coping with last week at work, and vice versa. I actually think this is a societal issue, and we need to actually look at it more broadly, just than through the lens of health and safety at work, although that has a significant part to play in that, in my view, going forward.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Just coming there, if I may, I think the management standards are useful, but we come back to the point that there are almost zero organisations that have been prosecuted under safety law for stress, for instance. There is no automatic referral to the executive when there's a suicide at work, and we remain in a situation where if they're not enforced, they fall down the agenda of corporate knowledge. So to my mind, I agree that it's a societal issue, and we do get into this whole thing about is an organisation's responsibility to get involved in what are effectively avuncular pursuits to look after general health, and I think that is it'd be interesting to see where the government gets to in that in the next 5 years.
Yeah, can I just without wishing to be semantic, distinguish between the word enforced and regulated, because they're sometimes used as being a synonym. And from my perspective, regulation is when the regulator is seeking to influence the behaviours of people, and enforcing through issuing notices and taking them to court is a subset of that. It is actually, I would have thought, very difficult to bring. I'm sure if there were easy cases where there is an obvious, if I mix my metaphors, smoking gun between stress drivers at work that causes adverse circumstances, I'm sure that there would be a case taken to do that. But I presume that it is very difficult to gather the evidence for the burden of proof that you'd have to take for a criminal court. And I just wonder whether we need to develop a policy and a framework for taking this forward, rather than saying what we need is more prosecutions. But if there is evidence for prosecutions, we need to actually do that. So it's not an either or.
Sorry,
from a different perspective, I also feel that perhaps the word mental in itself can be a taboo for some people, right? So shifting from the word mental itself, rather than calling someone, hey, you're mental, it has a different connotation to it, right? So coining it in a way that it becomes mind health, mindfulness, so that is something that is becoming more inclusive. And people may adopt it more. And also because when we talk about mental health, we've always heard of this phrase. They say depression doesn't have a face, right? So it's very difficult for organization, even individuals, to detect or to notice any change of their behavior. So it will be quite hard to establish something like what Paul has rightly pointed out. If you're not trained, if you're not if you don't know what to look out for, you can't assess it.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a real relevant topic area, and I'm glad we've had the conversation. And I suppose just thinking about a piece of work I was doing yesterday, that the HSE have funded a project. It's called Oscar, which is looking at sort of the prevention of work-related stress. So IOSH did contribute to that, because the deadline was yesterday, but it was just to flag that it is on the agenda, and the HSE are actively looking at work-related stress, and have got a project being funded that's with Affinity Health Consortium and a few others there. So we'll definitely still continue to see traction in this place. But I think I'm just sort of thinking of what you were mentioning a bit, Kevin, really right. It's what we call for. What is that strategic approach that's needed to make sure we can keep this agenda, it's got relevance, it's in place, and it can start to have that impact that we need. So I'm going to sort of just move on from mental health subtly, and I'm really interested in the sort of the worker status or the employment status, because I know within the UK at the moment there's the Employment Rights Bill that's being discussed, where there's employee, worker, self-employed status. And as you say, Kevin, we've got employees in there, we've got, the self-employed, but there's so many different worker statuses at the moment. I think you mentioned freelance, gig workers. So again, I guess I was just going to open the floor to see if there's any other thoughts on this point with regards to making it more of a singular term for worker. Is that helpful from a health and safety rights and protections perspective, or is it really useful to have the different terms in place as well for health and safety reasons? And I won't pick on anybody. I'll just say if anybody wants to answer that, you can. If not, I will also go to the Q&A in a moment and answer some of our listeners' questions.
Well, I personally believe that we need to do something to tighten the legislation to make it clear that organisations making money cannot transfer the risks of running their organisation to individual workers. And there is a risk that unless we tackle that issue, they will continue to attempt to do that. And I just don't think that's right. And I think it's worth looking at. And as I said, they have done so in Australia in a very, I wouldn't recommend going quite the way they've done it with, they've got some acronym called PBUS or something like that. Somebody doing a business or undertaking and that. And I looked at their model act in advance of this presentation, and it's 174 pages long. So I'm not holding it up as a paragon of virtue, but I do think there is something to learn from there.
As a lawyer,
Thanks, Kevin.
I'm a big advocate of 174 pages legislation, Kevin. You need lawyers to interpret that. What I would say is that whenever we are instructed on a case where the executive is looking to enforce, and it's normally a fatality kind of case, the first question is always around the employment status of the worker. And normally, if the organisation is prepared to concede that an agency worker, for instance, is a worker or an employee, then that makes things considerably easier. It seems to me that Kevin's entirely right, that having some kind of terser, more precise term would assist in terms of where the duty is owed. And it would also cover the bits that stop people getting badly hurt. I keep coming back to training, but in a situation where an organisation has got a de facto employee who's self-employed, they can welch out of the training obligations. And as we all know, competent trained people are less likely to get hurt. So I do think it's important that that particular area of greyness is made black and white.
Yeah, good points. Thank you, Paul. Neural, anything to add on this one before I move on?
I couldn't agree more with what Kevin and Paul has just shared, because I think that's right on the, you just hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Thank you. And I've got another couple of questions, but I've seen we have got 3 in the Q&A at the moment, which is probably the right time to come in on some of these, as what we've been talking about. I guess, Paul, I'm going into the second one. It might be something yourself where Patrick has given us a question saying, do you think the courts still view health and safety prosecutions in the same way, given some of the nonsense stories in the newspaper past recent years, like the health and safety tag and perception that it sometimes gets? So do you think across this period of time, do you think that there has been a change in view as well from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big difference is the Sentencing Council's guideline on sentencing for health safety, food safety and corporate manslaughter, which came into force in 2016. Before that, I could almost kind of give broad brush figures to any client that if they were very large and there was a fatality, they get fined no more than £250,000. And with a fair wind in a regulatory only offence, they get fined £20,000. Obviously, as anyone who reads the IOSH magazine will have seen, those numbers are a far cry from where we now are. And it's routine to say to clients, and I've had clients in court this year being fined £1, £2, £3 million, where there've been serious cases, but no worse than cases 8 years ago. So I think the courts do take them really seriously. What's quite interesting is that because the venues tend to have changed, historically things would be heard, certainly for major cases in the Crown Court, and now it's quite routine for matters to be heard in the Magistrates' Court before a ticketed district judge. Those judges tend to spend a lot of time really understanding the detail. And to my mind, they give really fair outcomes, doing a very careful exercise of balancing the culpability in particular and the harm. So I think the courts do take it very seriously. For a district judge in a magistrate's court, it's probably the most serious case he or she will see that year, in terms of where they might take a penalty. And I find that they invest an awful lot of time and do a really good job of that. And certainly if things go to the Crown Court, they're normally of major media significance, or they're very, very large organisations where there's a public desire for justice to be seen to be done. This is on a play rather than obviously on a trial. Clearly, in a Crown Court where matters go for trial, I do see jurors being very careful in the way they weigh the evidence. So I don't think there's any consideration of health and safety. Kind of revert back to my earlier comments about the numbers of prosecutions have gone down. And so the stuff that finds its way to court is actually really serious, normally involves very significant injuries or the loss of life. And so it's a far cry from the kind of health and safety matters that sometimes form civil proceedings.
Would
Yeah.
you say, Paul, that this is something that is precedent that has been taken into context since the beginning of 2006 corporate manslaughter,
So,
2016?
so corporate manslaughter came in 2009. It was a 2008 Act. But in 2016 in the UK, the way in which a sentencing court had to work out a fine was made more consistent. And so the Sentencing Council produced a guideline which set out 4 categories of organisation, from micro through to large. And large was defined as an organisation with a turnover over 50 million. Then it set out categories of harm and likelihood of harm and whether that harm happened. And then it looked at the culpability organisation. How far did it fall below the standard? And from that, a judge has to weigh up the defence and prosecution perspective and come up with a number. And I think that's the biggest difference in terms of the court's approach, is that it's now much more, you can almost, you know what to advise your client to expect because there's a regularity to it.
That's interesting, because in Singapore, we do have this calculator that we allow companies to calculate, approximately how much it will cost them in an event of an incident happening. So that's a free tool that all companies in Singapore can access as well. That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Paul.
The Sentencing Council, for those who are on the webinar, are actually consulting on what very large organisations may or not be fined, because it's a bit woolly in the guidance. So if you are a 200, 300, 500 million pound organisation, at the moment it says you can go outside the range. But what does that mean? And that consultation is due to close in November. I'm sure there'll be an IOSH article on it, Ruth.
There's always going to be an IOSH article. Thank you for the note there, Paul. And this has just got me reflecting back to what you said earlier, Kevin, about the Act sort of, that operating in this wider system. Because you're right, we have got the sentencing guidelines. There is the Corporate Manslaughter, Corporate Homicide Act, and that there's other levers that are working around as well. And apologies, Kevin, I wasn't sure if you wanted to come in on a point there.
Very quickly, I was just going to say that the sentencing guidelines are driven by 2 policy drivers from my perspective. One is consistency, but the second is the demands of society for accountability and justice. When I first started prosecuting in the magistrates' court, and I'd do my case and they get fined £200, and the case before me was somebody that dodged the fares on the underground and they'd be fined £150, I didn't get the sense that there was a societal view of the respective implications of what was being brought before them. I think there is now much more, but as Paul said, it's actually probably more reputational damage than the actual financial penalties that has the impact on companies in these days of corporate social responsibility, EDI, and all of that.
Yeah, and so that brings me to the next question I was going to pose, really, that we've moved 50 years on since the Act, and it is hard to say what are the next 50 years going to hold. We're at this point, we're talking about actually I think in consensus, we've almost sort of said across panelists that the Act is fit for purpose, but there's the regulator aspect where there could be some strengthening of resource. There's some additional, potentially explicit changes to terminology in there from mental health, maybe occupational health or psychosocial risks. Also amendments to the article, as you said, Kevin, around, because there is AI coming in at the moment. Does that sufficiently cover it? So we've had really fruitful dialogue from all of you. So sort of thinking, we don't know what the changes are coming, and there will continue to be changes, like the AI will evolve. There'll be other technological advancements, and there's also climate change, which we haven't mentioned at the moment. But what do you think the future holds? Is there, sort of thinking, we're saying it's fit for purpose with what we know now. Is there anything you can see coming up on that horizon? What does that future hold that we might need to also factor in? Neural, I'll come to you. I don't think I've come to you for a little while first. So if I can come to you, please, on that one.
For the next 50 years, when you brought up climate change, I disagree, because at this stage, we are not in a climate change, we're in a climate crisis, because that changes the whole ball game altogether, because we are not changing. It's no longer, we are no longer being proactive. We are reacting to circumstances. And because we are reacting to circumstances, from a health and safety point of view, there would have been death, there would have been chronic injuries, diseases that we will probably know about in the next 20, 30 years. So it will continue to be a challenge. It will definitely shape how workplace safety and health will change. That will incorporate technology, incorporate AI, incorporate environmental aspects because of the climate crisis, and more people are working remotely from home. So that's the other factor that we've got to shift our focus as well. How do we ensure that people working remotely are also taken care of? Are they overcompensating because they're working from home? So there are a lot of circumstances and areas that we've got to look into as well.
Yeah, some food for thought there, Neural. I did like the climate crisis now, not the climate change. So it just get you thinking of that timeline. Kevin, across to you next, please, on this one. So, what does the future hold?
Well, I think gravity will probably be the same in 50 years' time. So, our construction workers and people working at height, those risks are still going to exist. Perhaps our big transport things on sites might be driven by robots, but there's still going to be a risk of contact. So, I think that some things will stay the same. We'll get new challenges. What we need to do is adopt the proactive, preventative philosophy enshrined in the Health and Safety at Work Act and in the Robins report, that people that are developing new technologies and things like that are responsible for thinking conscientiously about them going forward, and thinking through the health and safety implications of what they're doing. In terms of the climate debate, I think the potential implications of that actually knock health and safety implications into a sort of minor bit part player in some parts of the world. So I think we ought to be trying to fix the climate thing rather than looking at the health and safety implications. I think there are, we've had COVID. I think climate change and other things are likely to increase pandemic type risks for us, both as a society, but also in the context of the work environment. And hopefully, we'll be better prepared for the next one when that comes along. The transition to away from oil and gas raises risk profiles in terms of decommissioning and stuff like that in the North Sea, and raises risks about some of the new technologies that replace them that we need to think about proactively, and that. But the framework and the responsibilities is there to cope with that.
Oh, lots of other good thoughts there. I'm looking at my time. I've got 2 minutes. Paul, I'd like to come to you on this one as well, please. This is a nugget of a question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me at the moment, the Act only recognises two categories of people outside of worker, and they are young people and pregnant people. And I think that as our society over the last 50 years has come to appreciate particularly neurodiversity as a key element in the way in which people perform at work, I believe that actually the Act over the next 50 years needs to give greater consideration to the worker, and that it should actually set out the equivalent of a pregnant person's risk assessment or a young person's risk assessment if somebody has a clearly diagnosed neurological condition which requires them to have special measures taken. And I think that is an area that wasn't envisaged 50 years ago, but in the society we now live would make a massive difference to providing a framework for people and embrace the current spirit of ED&I.
Brilliant. And at that point, we did have another question in the Q&A, which was asking about emerging risks, and all of the panelists have given us their thoughts. And I mean, you sort of throw in there that we have got the rise of the gig economy, the informal economy, modern slavery is still happening, and it's cross global supply chains. The occupational safety and health risks are still there. And I'm sort of feel supported in the fact that we've had that conversation to say the legislation we've got is fit for purpose, albeit there's a few things that we suggest, and I do like that you've pulled out the young and the pregnant people there. So we've got vulnerable worker categories, but we know that there are others that we need to consider in there. And sorry, Ben, if we overrun by 1 or 2 minutes, but I will just like to ask all of our panelists before I say my thank yous, is there anything sort of in the few words that you'd like to have a final comment on with regards to the Act before we depart? And I'll go, Kevin, any final comment from you?
I don't think so. I think I've made most of the points that flitted through my head when I was thinking about this during the course of this conversation. I'm glad that we concluded that the Act is fit for purpose, and that is because it's future proofed. And we don't want to start responding to new risks by writing detailed rules, because by the time we've written them, the risks will have moved on. So a goal setting, outcome based approach. That's different from campaigns on particular risks or issues that are more contemporary, that need addressing, and they need to be considered on their merits, but proactively.
Lovely. Thank you, Kevin. Paul?
I'm just going to plug the excellent IOSH article in this month's IOSH magazine, which sets out the legal view of 50 years of Health and Safety at Work Act. It contains the opinions of 8 KCs in respect of their views of the Act, which I'm pleased to say mirror ours. So, but for those who've not read that, that's in this month's IOSH magazine.
Oh, he's good, isn't he? Thank you, Paul, for that plug and for that comment. Neural?
All I can say as a key takeaway about the Act is always about, having better data to make better judgment, and how we can use our reactive data to be more proactive in our work arrangements and work statistics as well. So it has been a very good insights from Kevin and Paul as well.
Fantastic. You see, I've got Neural here doing this. Thank you for me, and I'm hoping everybody listening has had a really good session, because I, for one, I've really enjoyed this. We've had a natural flow of conversation, lots of fruitful and insightful thoughts and ideas have been shared, and all I can say is that I will take that away into my sort of role and remit at IOSH as well. And my thanks to you, Kevin, Paul, and Neural for joining with all your own individual perspectives. It's been a pleasure. Thank you ever so much, and
Thank you.
we'll be in touch again soon. Thank you for everybody listening, and I hope you've
Cheers.
enjoyed the session. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.